this is a real major story in MMA, and that concerns this betting scandal that's going on. So, just to bring people up to speed, earlier this month there was a fight night card between two fighters, Shailin Nordenbeka and Derek Minner. And going into this fight, the day of, several hours before, Nordenbeka was a minus 220 favorite and then increased to a minus 420 favorite. That's a pretty big swing in the numbers in the fight leading up to it. And there was money coming in on Nordenbeka to win in the first round or under 2.5 rounds. And Minner came in, threw a leg kick, and then he was in pain instantly from this leg kick, threw another one, and then got finished in the first round where all this money had come in. And it was enough that several investigations got launched into what led to the line swinging, and was there anything just that was that should be looked into about this case. So after those investigations were launched, Derek Minner, he was facing disciplinary action by the commission for not disclosing a previous injury coming into the fight. And that is sort of where this started. You can't necessarily make any broad accusations of like what went on here, but it is believed that, he at least came in with an injury. And one theory is, did people around him know about this injury? And thus he was not going to be favored to win, and who put money on this. So his coach is James Krause, who is a former fighter and, very well known for, he ran this big Discord channel and did a podcast on bets, and he bet on all of these fights and stuff. So he's kind of being focused on here. New Jersey kind of stepped in and didn't want any bets done for fighters attached to James Krause. And then this week, the province of Ontario and Alberta has followed suit. They are now prohibiting sports books from taking bets on any UFC fights, which is a massive statement by those two provinces. You're talking about Ontario, which is, a 15 million population base. So today the UFC, they sent out a statement, and for the time being, while these investigations are going on, no fighters that have any association with James Krause are allowed to compete in the UFC. The UFC has also released Derek Minner, and so this is obviously, if you read sort of the decision-making process by the Ontario Gaming Board, they are not just necessarily talking about this, but it almost, you get a feel like they're looking at just from a broad scope in terms of, it's very interesting in UFC because, guys are always hurt. And what UFC is trying to do, and they had recently put out a memo that fighters are not allowed to bet on fights. Their coaches can't bet on fights. Their family can't bet on fights. And, everyone's going to have injuries. And then you have this gambling component, and one of their big sponsors in UFC is DraftKings. So, gambling is only increasing now. And in fighting, like you had the case a couple of weeks ago with TJ Dillashaw, where he went into this fight and he gets beat, and then he explains after, like, his shoulder popped out like 20 times during his camp. And it's like, you went into this fight with basically no chance of winning. And, that one stayed relatively quiet. But, if that gets around and there's teammates around you, there's family, and now you have a way to make money off of this, like, it becomes like a very difficult balancing act, as well as very difficult to enforce all of this. And you have these gaming companies that are just, at least in Ontario and Alberta, they're just wiping their hands of it while this is going on. Like, this is just too unpredictable for us, and there's just too many opportunities to manipulate the system. So I don't know if this is just going to be isolated to this fight where we saw the swing in numbers, or if this is a larger kind of investigation into the sport of, fighters that are, notoriously underpaid, and then you have access to information. And like James Krause, he was on the MMA Hour not too long ago stating he makes more money betting on fights than he does anything else. So he was like an avid gambler. So, you just put all of these different elements together, it makes it like it's hardly an easy answer that you have to conclude to this, but that's where all these sports are driving revenue from, is these gambling outfits. And MMA is, or UFC specifically, is very much under the microscope.
Is there something about MMA that kind of makes it more susceptible to this sort of I don't know, malpractice than other sports? Because I imagine any sport that has coaching, which is basically every sport, is susceptible to some sort of insider information type of thing. But is it because MMA is such a one-on-one activity that one fighter's injury makes such a big difference?
I think that that's something to it, is that, if you get intel that, this shortstop has a bad ankle, it's like, are you necessarily, does that bring a team down? Not necessarily. This is, number one, it's a one-on-one sport. The information is traveling a lot. If there's a big injury with a sports team, it's like they're disclosing these injuries, like kind of for like, there's a lot more transparency. You might not know the specific injury, but it's a lot different. Like if your pitcher has like a bad arm, they're not putting them out there, or they're disclosing to the public that he's on the disabled list. This is the reason. And in this sport, like, there's a lot more that's just clouded in secrecy, because if you're TJ Dillashaw and you haven't fought for an entire year as he had, and you've got this big opportunity to fight for a title, you're just going to work through this injury. But if that information gets out that, hey man, TJ's shoulder's been popping out, and this exists everywhere in gyms, like rumors get out about guys that are hurt going into fights, and that's naturally going to raise suspicion if you have an outlet where you can profit off of that information that the public is not that the public is not privy to. Or in the case of, like, again, going back to the TJ Dillashaw one, you, the consumer, are buying this pay-per-view, and should that be like, you are not getting the best TJ Dillashaw in that fight, and you're asking fans to spend $60 on a pay-per-view. Like, it's a lot of like philosophical questions that come with these as well, and I do not envy the person that has to police this, because it's nearly impossible.
Yeah. So ideally, if a fighter suffers an injury, they have to disclose that to the UFC and therefore the public. Is that the case?
It's not so much that they have to disclose it, but it's almost like the trust system that, they're, the people around you are, like, in the UFC now, it is part of the code of conduct that way, if you are training for a fight and I'm your training partner, you cannot bet on your fight. I cannot bet on your fight. Your wife cannot bet on your fight. But if you're fighting for the UFC, like, is there somebody that is, okay, it's one thing to like administer like you betting on fights, but who's tracking down your cousin Way that knows that you've got a terrible knee injury that is going to need surgery after this fight, but you need to do this fight because you paid for your camp and you make 20 and 20 a fight, and you're not going to pull out of it. But I know that you're not going to do well in this fight because your ACL is like partially torn.
I would say it's nearly impossible to police, unless somehow there's a very deep sort of vetting system to make sure, like, no suspicious money ever gets into every single person's bank account. But that's almost impossible. Now, how did they prevent this? How did they prevent insider trading, from occurring in the stock market? What practices can we apply from that world into potentially fighting? And ultimately, is it worth it, for them to institute something so, I don't know, thorough?
Well, I mean, in this case, I mean, it's something where, it's, in this case, the line moved to such a degree that it raised alarm bells. And, when you're dealing with like gaming boards and stuff, like, this is their 24/7 vocation. And I think, like, you're certainly, it's going to be very difficult, I think, to for a line like that to see that kind of movement. It's like they know what is suspicious and what is just the normal course of activity. But, I think for the immediate future is that, these fights are going to be very, very heavily scrutinized. And this goes beyond just like a DraftKings relationship. It's like, if you're the UFC, and the UFC, like, there's no obviously evidence that, they have done anything here, but, you have a promoter's license and you want to be sanctioned in all of these states. And this is the kind of, story you don't want attached to your brand. So I think the UFC is very much incentivized to stomp this out, but how you go about doing that, that's going to be, to me, a really, really complicated web to navigate.